Welcome back! We've made it to our last video in our Advent Spiritual Disciplines series. I think that it's appropriate that at this time in the Salvation Army we take the time to make a video about Sabbath keeping. If the fourth commandment is to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy, and Jesus reminded us that the Sabbath was made for man, then it's got two testaments of support as to why we should practice it. It's repeated because it's important. So Sabbath is actually not just a Sunday. It's more than just a day that we take out of the week to go to church, even though church fellowship might be a part of how we practice Sabbath. Sabbath is actually a time that we take to intentionally rest, to not work, and it's a time that we can trust and build our confidence in God. Sabbath as a spiritual discipline is a time to refrain from your normal responsibilities and spend time to pray and play with God and others. It's not just sitting in devotions for 24 hours. You pray and you play with God and others. Like all the other disciplines, we do this intentionally, but we have to intentionally schedule time to stop working. If we don't, we know from experience that if we don't schedule time to stop, our to-do list keeps growing and the list of responsibilities gets longer and things pop up. And so in order for us to take time for our bodies and our minds and our hearts and souls to stop and to rest, we've got to be intentional about setting that time aside. If we don't take that time, we are eventually going to burn out, we're going to run ourselves into the ground, and we'll have to be forced to take time to rest. And that's not how God intended it. He does not want us to work ourselves to death. He wants us to stop and take time to recover before moving on to another week's work. We see the command to rest outside of the Ten Commandments, again in Exodus chapter 23, and then again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The Lord clearly states, the Sabbath is a time for you to not work, but to rest. And it's not just you, it's also your children, the people who work for you, your animals, even the sojourner who lives among you. Don't put people that left their home and came to live among you at a disadvantage so that they have to work while the rest of you rest. This is not something that's reserved just for the top tier of the family. This is something that incorporates the entire community. Rest is intended for every occupation, every social class, every living being is commanded to take this time to rest. And it's not just something that's between you and the Lord. There's now this community aspect. Your rest impacts the people around you and benefits your community. This rest is not just a time for you to spend in God's presence, but it's also innately connected to the people around you. This community element is also a love your neighbor element. And so the more you rest, the more you benefit the people around you and are able to treat people with that love and respect that God asks of us all through Scripture. You don't rest in isolation. Your rest impacts your community. So Sabbath is taking time to rest, to not work, but it's not quite the same as a day off. We don't take a Sabbath in order to work from home. We don't Sabbath in order to catch up on other things that need to be done. Sabbath is not a time for you to sit and binge watch an entire season of something on Netflix. That's not actually restful. It might distract you for a little bit, but it doesn't give you that deep sense of rest and trust. Sabbath is a time for you to pray and play with God and others. And so what you're doing in Sabbath is looking for those things that provide you with consolation. What are the things that bring you closer to God? And so if you're Sabbathing as a family, as a group of friends, what you're doing is doing things that restore your being, not just things that distract you from the everyday. Part of our Sabbath is intentionally taking time to spend with God. So that could be a Sunday when you do church fellowship. You go to church, you fellowship with believers, you worship. If it's not on a Sunday or if it's later on in the day, you might be taking time to spend in solitude and silence. This is a way to intentionally set apart time to slow down, take a rest with God, in the presence of God. Maybe you're working on a Sabbath together as a family. And so as you're praying and playing with others, not just with God, maybe what you're doing is a family activity that helps you all to rest. So maybe that's playing a game together. Some families go on a hike. So this is a time when we break out those activities of consolation. What brings us closer to God? Some people like to bake on their Sabbath. Some people like to read. Some people like to take the whole family together and go do something fun, whatever that might be for your family. You want to actively spend time enjoying each other and enjoying God's presence in your everyday, ordinary life. We take time to rest in a way that restores our body, but also restores our spirits. We want to let God restore the weariness that comes from the entire week's worth of work that we've just done. So you might remember the time that Jesus fell asleep in the boat while the storm was going on. I think there's a meme floating around the internet that says, remember, something to the effect of, remember, even in busy times, Jesus took naps. And it's said a little tongue-in-cheek, but I love it. I think it's entirely true. Jesus sleeping in the storm reminds us of a couple of things. One, that when Jesus was tired, he slept. How often do we not do that? How often do we get tired and we push through instead of taking time to sleep or to rest? And two, it shows us that Jesus sleeping through a storm embodies a trust and a confidence that God was in control and that he was taking care of Jesus, of the disciples, even in the midst of something that in outward appearances seems really scary. We are not in control of everything around us. And keeping a Sabbath invites us to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that God is in control. That our rest allows us to say, God's got it, and we don't have to be in charge of it. We can let go of that and let God be God. Let him have that authority over your life, because the world's not going to stop because you stopped working for a day. I know we have a hard time accepting that sometimes, that things have to get done, and I am not immune to this understanding, so I get it. But when we relinquish that control, we place our trust in the one who is in control, and we let him be God without us needing to interfere. We have limitations, and so by letting God be in control, we are silencing our fears, letting them be still, like that sea that Jesus told to be still and to be calm. Psalm 127 verse 2 says, "For it is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. For he, for God, gives his beloved sleep." Sleep is a gift from God. Embrace that. So to practice Sabbath, allow yourself to sleep. That is a genuine way to practice Sabbath. Sleep a little longer. Allow yourself not to set an alarm or to set a later alarm. Get up a little bit later. Those of you with small children, I understand that this is sometimes difficult, and I get that. But maybe go to sleep a little earlier, or lay in bed in the morning a little longer, or take a nap. Naps are good. You can slow down. Live your life at a slower pace than usual. Take your time doing things to get somewhere or to finish an activity. Don't rush through. And to practice Sabbath, set some boundaries. Say no to things that you know will interrupt your Sabbath, or say no to expectations that people might have of you. Spend your time enjoying the presence of God and being present with the people around you. Have fun being with these people and being with God, and watch how God shows up in your everyday, ordinary life, in your relationships with your family, with your friends, or just you and God by yourself. Watch how he wants to sit with you, even in your rest. So try to do this once a week. We say that Sabbath is on Sunday, but if you work in a church setting, you might not be able to take Sunday as your Sabbath. If you're working, you're not Sabbathing. And so you might need to set aside a Saturday as your Sabbath. Or maybe you work in a place where your work schedule isn't determined until the week or two before, and you don't know what your calendar looks like. When you get your schedule, schedule yourself some Sabbath time in there. And if you have a job that doesn't allow you to take full days off, maybe then you set aside half days. Do a couple of half days a week for Sabbath. Or try to do a late afternoon into the next morning for Sabbath. Whatever you can do with how your life is structured, work at it. Intentionally set aside that time. In the world that we live in, it's not always possible to Sabbath one full day a week. And that's okay. But try to be intentional, because it doesn't mean that you should neglect it. Make sure that you are scheduling that time for yourself, because it's going to matter in the long run. And it's going to keep you sustained in the long run. Because if you're not Sabbathing, if you're working too hard, you're running yourself down, and you're going to feel it mentally, emotionally, and physically. It's vital for your soul, for your body, and it benefits the community of people around you. So now that Christmas time is almost over in the Salvation Army, I hope that you and your family are able to schedule some time to Sabbath and to rest. I pray that you can enter God's rest as you celebrate all of His good gifts to you, including His Son, Jesus Christ. And from all of us here at the Salvation Army of Gwinnett, we wish you a very Merry Christmas.